Hey everybody, welcome back to an all new episode of 10 to Life with me, Annie Elise. I'm still having some jaw issues, guys. Be kind, but we're still gonna talk about this case today because it is one that is heartbreaking, frustrating, and kind of gives you all of the feels. So if you are brand new and you have never checked out this channel before, welcome. I am so happy to have you here today. And for all of my returning 10 to Lifers, thank you as always for watching, supporting, and doing all the things. Now, for a second, I want you to just step back, okay? And imagine a story where a woman is in a toxic, dangerous relationship. Her boyfriend is violent, he has a history of physically assaulting her, and she even takes out a restraining order against him. But she hasn't left him yet. Leaving a partner like this is one of the most dangerous things you can do. We know that, right? So we have to just trust that people know their own situation better than anybody on the outside. They will leave when they are ready. And this person is making the call that makes the most sense for her at the time, what she feels the most comfortable with. Now, let's imagine that both the woman in this situation and her boyfriend end up dead in very highly suspicious circumstances. It sounds pretty obvious what happened, right? He must have killed her. Well, I will say, that's what the police thought when Holly Williams and Bill Lanway were found dead in 2020. They saw this long history of domestic disturbances. She had filed a restraining order against him just days before her death. The writing was on the wall. So the detectives figured, oh, okay, he must have killed her and then himself. But then there were a few bits of evidence that just didn't fit that narrative. And when the investigators began to scratch beneath the surface, they uncovered one of the most wild, twisted plots I've ever seen. It almost defies logic, defies belief, all of the things. And if you think that you know where this story is going, think again, because you cannot predict how this one ends. It is a wild roller coaster of a case, guys. Let's jump right into it. Holly Williams was born on January 14, 1987, and grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. It's a city just over 35 miles from the heart of downtown Nashville. Now, Nashville is famous for being the home of country music, and with very good reason. There's an enormous music scene in Nashville, but it's also full of art, museums, food, and it was a really trendy place to grow up near, with a lot to offer. But in spite of all of that, Holly, unfortunately, had a really difficult childhood. Her parents divorced while she was still young, and she had a very tense relationship with her mom. It was bad enough that Holly moved in with her father and her stepmom for a little while as well. Now, through all of these changes, Holly kept dreaming of her big, exciting future. She eventually moved to downtown Nashville, and she became an esthetician, which is what you call a skincare professional, somebody who does facials, all of the skincare things. But even though Holly accomplished a lot after moving, the decision to be away from her family was a pretty difficult one, and her relationship with her mom was not getting any better. Eventually, she cut off all contact with her. Now, Holly did try to keep having a healthy relationship with her 5 siblings. She was always making sure that they felt included, loved, cared for, and she was especially close with her sister Emily. They spent every single holiday together. They would carve pumpkins together on Halloween. They'd wear matching pajamas on Christmas. And that was kind of just the person that Holly was. She really cared about people, almost to a fault. She always wanted to believe the best in all of the people that she met, and she wanted to believe that everybody had good intentions. But obviously, and unfortunately, that isn't always the case. We know that. Now, I don't know the full specifics, but according to Holly's friends, people were always taking advantage of her. And a few times, she even ended up in some really scary situations and very toxic relationships. For example, in 2018, Holly met this guy. He was a car mechanic, and his name was Bill Lanway. They were at a music festival. They clicked right away. They were both familiar with the nightlife, the party scene in Nashville. They also both loved to go to bars, to dance, and just have fun. And Bill Bill was a lot like Holly. People thought that he was just irresistible because he was so energetic, so outgoing, and the life of the party. He was one of those people, and when he showed up, everybody knew that they were going to have a good time because it was honestly impossible not to have fun when Bill was around. Now, that wasn't all that he had in common with Holly, though. He also had a difficult childhood, just as she had. However, his was way, way worse. Bill was born on March 17, 1983, in a town called Clarksville, which is in northern Tennessee. When he was 3.5, Bill's mother and father went out for the night, and Bill and his sister stayed home with a babysitter. Now, that's all pretty normal, but when Bill's parents got home, they began arguing. Things escalated really fast, and Bill's father, Lyle, ended up holding everybody hostage for hours. Now, the good news is nobody got hurt. Eventually, Bill's dad let everybody go, and he was arrested and then taken to a psychiatric facility for treatment. But he didn't stay there long, though. Just 1 week later, on Thanksgiving to be exact, they released Lyle so that he could visit his family for the holiday. And sadly, as soon as he got to the apartment, he grabbed a knife and he stabbed his wife, killing her. Now, Bill and his sister, they witnessed the whole thing. They ran to their neighbor's apartment for help, which was a good call because Lyle was not done. He was on a rampage. He stabbed a different neighbor, not the one who was helping the kids, but then he stabbed himself before running from the police entirely. He was eventually caught, and this time the authorities didn't send him to a hospital. They sentenced Lyle to life in prison, which was where he stayed until he got out on parole more than 30 years later, in 2017. So even though Bill's father was still alive, he wasn't in the picture for most of Bill's life. Bill was basically an orphan. His aunt and uncle raised him and his sister, but he did not have parents. Now, you would think that with that kind of violent, terrifying history, Bill would be super withdrawn, that he would be scared of the world. But he kind of grew up to be the opposite kind of person. Everybody knew him as a fun, outgoing guy, and he was even voted the best personality in high school. And like I said earlier, Bill, he loved to party. But we need to talk about some of the other dark stuff that went down before he met Holly, because it ended up having a really big impact on their relationship. In his early 20s, Bill was having a party at his house one night when he met a woman named Dana Jones. Dana was 4 years younger than Bill and also still in high school. In spite of the age difference, they got along great though, and over time, they started having a very casual, like friends with benefits type sort of relationship. Which I have to say, it's kind of a huge red flag to me because I don't know their exact ages at the time, but I do know that Bill was a young adult, and Dana couldn't even legally vote yet. But although he was older, he was just a little too old to be covered by those Romeo and Juliet laws. They apply in Tennessee if the age gap is less than 4 years. And we also know that they were sexually active because just 6 months after they started hooking up, Dana learned that she was pregnant. Even though their relationship hadn't been very serious up until then, they were really excited to have a baby together, and they both committed to starting a family. Dana gave birth to a baby girl named Madison, and she was basically a daddy's girl through and through, just super close to Bill. They absolutely adored each other. But then, in May of 2010, when Madison was only 4 years old, she became super sick. For 3 weeks straight, she had flu-like symptoms that never improved. So Bill and Dana took her to the emergency room, of course, and that's where the doctors diagnosed her with a very rare and aggressive form of brain cancer. It had already spread to her lungs and her pancreas by this point as well. Now, thanks to the miracle of modern medicine and a very, very intense treatment plan, Madison went into remission after a year. And I have to imagine Bill and Dana were thrilled that their daughter was recovering. But their happiness, it only lasted a short while, and a few months later, the cancer came back, and this time it was worse than before. That fall, on September 21st, 2011, Madison ended up passing away after her long battle with cancer. And honestly, as a parent, I can't even imagine how Bill and Dana dealt with that. Because for me, the thought of my children getting hurt or sick, let alone dying, it honestly eats my insides up. I don't understand how anyone can ever move past something like that. It is just absolutely heartbreaking, and especially to have hope that she was in remission and covering, it's just brutal. So it's not surprising to me at all that Bill and Dana were devastated by this. In particular, Bill's entire personality changed. He wasn't outgoing anymore, and it was like he just withdrew into himself. It was like he didn't want to even be a part of the world anymore, if that makes sense. On top of that, he started acting angry and very irrational. When his temper flared up, which was a lot of the time, he would lash out at Dana. He even damaged some of her property, according to an interview that she gave to 2020. Now, this outburst, it was the last straw for Dana. Their relationship was already super strained, which is pretty common when it comes to the death of a child. It's tough for the parents to stay committed to one another when they're both just drowning in grief. But now, with Bill's new unhealthy and violent behavior, she was done. So after Maddie's funeral, Dana gave Bill a box of Maddie's things and told him to leave and never contact her again. He took her request to heart, and he disappeared from her life entirely after that. Now, Dana, she wasn't the only person who Bill withdrew from. After Maddie died, it was basically like he didn't want to have anything to do with anybody anymore. He wouldn't talk to people, he wouldn't make plans, he just shut down. And there was only one way to get him out of his shell, by taking him to a party. And I know it sounds like a contradiction, but Bill's friends realized that if they got him into a crowd of people and put a drink in his hands, it was almost like he would just go right back to being his old self. If he was at a bar or a club, he'd be talkative, he'd be laughing, he would be having fun. Now, I'm no mental health professional, I'm not going to even try to pretend to be, but I will say that it's not a good idea to run away from your problems, even if, in the eyes of Bill's friends, it might have felt like they were doing the right thing at the time. So while Bill was out at all of those bars, clubs, and festivals, that's when he met Holly. He still had never really dealt with all of the trauma he had experienced, though, and he was still suffering from emotional issues pretty severely. But that didn't stop him from starting to see her romantically anyway. And like I said before, Holly, she had her fair share of problems as well. She was really quick to trust people, even when there was no indication that that person was actually trustworthy. So when Bill and Holly started dating, it was really only a matter of time before their relationship became pretty chaotic. Beginning in 2018, they were stuck in this kind of like on and off again pattern where they would date, then they would have this super dramatic breakup, then they would get back together again and wash, rinse, repeat. You know how it goes. Pretty much everybody who knew Bill and Holly thought that their relationship was extremely toxic. And a couple of times, Holly even texted her friends and basically said that she was scared of him. Not in so many words, but she implied that she thought that he might hurt her. And as time went on, their relationship got even worse. According to Holly, in December of 2019, Bill broke her car's windshield and he punched her in the mouth. Somebody called the police and Bill was arrested, but Holly said that she did not want to press charges. She said she would handle it herself. It would be easy to judge her or blame her for not doing anything, but Holly, she knew her situation. She knew Bill really well, and she could make an educated guess about how he might react if she did take legal action. I would love to personally live in a world where it was always safe and smart for people to call the police when they're stuck dating somebody who is dangerous, but sometimes getting the police involved can make somebody's partner escalate to even more threatening behavior. So I'm sure that Holly had her reasons. A few months later, in March of 2020, Bill lashed out at her again, though. This time, they were at Holly's apartment when they started arguing, and then Bill held his hand over her mouth so she couldn't breathe. Luckily, Holly managed to get away, and Bill eventually left her apartment. At some point during this fight, though, Holly's little dog Max also went missing, which is a very important detail that I'll come back to later. But for now, we just need to know that after the argument, Holly went to the police, and she said that she was now ready to take legal action against Bill. Eventually, they charged Bill with aggravated assault and false imprisonment, but he got out on bond. Now, Holly must have been worried that he would do something again, because that's when she decided to take out a protective order against Bill. Then, a few days after that, Holly found her dog Max, but he was dead on the side of the road. Sure, it could have been a coincidence. It was possible that Max got out during the fight, especially if he was scared and picking up on the tension, and then maybe he had run into the road, he had been hit by a car. But the timing of it all, I don't know, it was a little bit more than suspicious. All of it had gone down in the space of just a couple of weeks. Bill and Holly fought, she pressed charges, she got a restraining order, and now her dog died? Holly believed that Bill had killed Max as a way to punish her for taking out that protective order, or to at least send her a message of some kind. The problem was she just couldn't prove it. Either way, Holly was now really frightened of Bill because it seemed like he was showing her what he was capable of. And to all appearances, Holly was completely in the right to be afraid, because just a few days after her dog Max's death, she and Bill both turned up dead too. It was March 13th, 2020, when a construction worker called 911. They said that they found a car that had run off the road and it hit a tree. It was all smashed up, and the worker could see two people inside, a man and a woman, and they appeared to be dead. It was Bill and Holly. Bill's body was on the floor of the front passenger seat, and Holly was in the back. Initially, it looked like maybe they had gotten into an accident, but then the police got a closer look, and they saw that Bill and Holly had both been shot multiple times. Bill had 2 head wounds, including one close to his temple on the right side, and Holly had been shot in the head and the chest. An autopsy report showed that the chest wound did not kill Holly right away. She survived for a while before she was then shot in the head. However, Bill's wounds, they were fatal almost immediately. Then, when the police looked at Holly and Bill's records and saw this long history of domestic disputes, including the restraining order that Holly had filed just 9 days before, it was all pretty suspicious. So the detectives came up with a theory. Maybe when Bill realized that Holly was ready to leave him for good, he convinced her to get in the car with him. Then he shot her, then shot himself. While Bill was dead and Holly was dying in the back seat, the car ran off the road and hit the tree. It seemed like a plausible theory, and once Holly's friends and family members heard about what had happened, they thought the police's theory sounded probable. Bill really did seem like the kind of person who would kill Holly and take his own life after. Even Bill's friends and family, the people who you would expect to defend him and have his back, they sort of just accepted that it was something that he would do. They all knew about his recent issues and how he had treated Holly. So a simple open and shut case pretty much, right? Bill and Holly died in a murder-suicide. It's settled. It's solved. Except there were a couple pieces of evidence that didn't fit that narrative. And the detectives, they spent some time trying to make it all fit together before they had to admit that maybe Bill didn't do this. First, Bill's body was on the passenger side of the car, and Holly was in the back. Neither one of them was in the driver's seat. I suppose you could argue that the car hit the tree, and with enough force, it sent Bill flying from one side of the car to the other. But it seems a lot easier to believe that maybe somebody else had been driving. Second, Bill and Holly's cell phones weren't in the car with them. And this was 2020, guys. Everybody carried their phones with them everywhere they went. Now, one thought was that maybe Bill left his phone at home on purpose, especially if he knew that he was going to kill Holly and take his own life before the drive was over. He would want to make it as difficult as possible for anybody to track him, to stop him. But nobody could figure out why Holly would leave her phone at home too. She wouldn't leave it behind on purpose, especially if she was even the tiniest bit suspicious that Bill might try something. So on their own, the missing cell phones might have just been one of those things where you say, that doesn't make that much sense, but I guess we'll never know. But there was something else that the police could not find anywhere in the car, and the absence of this item really made the detectives throw out the entire Bill did it theory. See, there was no murder weapon, not anywhere near the scene. So imagine that Bill shot Holly, then took his own life. Then after they were both dead or injured, the car ran off the road on its own into the tree. The gun would still be in the car, right? Even if Bill's gunshot wounds weren't fatal right away and he was conscious long enough to toss the gun out the window, it still would have landed close to the road. But the police searched everywhere, and there was no gun.
But when the vehicle is pulled up from the embankment, police discover clear signs of foul play.
From the outside, it looked like a car crash, but when you looked inside, it wasn't a car crash.
The passenger windows were broken out, but there was no glass around the vehicle anywhere to be seen. Typically on a traffic crash, you'd see glass on the inside and on the outside.
Still, since it looked so much like a murder and purposefully taking your own life after that, the police came up with another theory. Maybe somebody staged the scene specifically to mislead them. It could have been a professional hit, maybe done by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. The problem was, once the police ruled Bill out, there weren't any other obvious suspects. Nobody seemed to think that Bill or Holly had any enemies either. But Holly did have a bunch of security cameras in her home. So the investigators pulled that footage just to see if anybody had been dropping by, maybe acting suspicious, that sort of thing. And they found some very interesting clips that were super recent, right after that latest domestic dispute, to be exact. Specifically, the one where Max, the dog, went missing. So after Bill left, Holly took a bunch of steps to try and protect herself, and the cameras filmed everything. She went to her apartment management and had them install a new deadbolt on her door, and in the footage, she talked about how she was doing it because she was scared of Bill. Not long after she got the new locks, Bill actually came back and tried to break in, and again, this was all on film. He got past an electronic lock on the front door, he got inside, and then he wandered around for a little while. It seemed like he was looking for Holly, but luckily for her, she was out at the time. Now, on its own, this only made Bill look way more guilty. But after his break-in, a few other guys dropped by. The police found clip after clip of one man after another knocking on her door and asking for her by name. Now, this was especially weird because the men were trying to hide their faces from the cameras, so clearly they weren't ordinary delivery men or anything like that, really. Then, on March 10th, 3 men all showed up together. They were all wearing black, and they all had their faces covered. They knocked on the door, and they were yelling Holly's name, and they also just kept saying that they just wanted to talk. Now, Holly was home, but clearly she didn't believe them, and she wasn't willing to talk. And the cameras actually showed her running around until she found this thing called a safety bar to keep her door from being opened. So basically, she blocked the guys from breaking it down and forcing their way inside. So clearly, those 3 men, they were worth investigating, right? Especially now that Holly and Bill were dead. But the problem was the detectives couldn't tell who they were, especially with their faces covered. One of the men had part of his face exposed, but it wasn't enough to make an identification. The police released some of these pictures to the public, though, thinking that maybe somebody would recognize them anyway. But that didn't work. Nobody called in with any helpful information. So that meant that the next step was to dig into Holly's personal life to see if maybe she might have known these guys through her job or maybe her social circle, surely something. And they only talked to a couple of people before they learned that Holly wasn't only working as an esthetician in Nashville. She was also doing escort work on the side. She'd been doing it since she was 18 or 19 years old, and from the sounds of it, she was pretty open about what she did. It was no big secret. Lots of her friends knew, and they told the police all about it. Holly used the name Layla Love, and she was mostly based in Nashville, but sometimes she would travel to other cities. Now, it was worth it because her clients, they paid her very well, not just in cash. The men also gave her very expensive gifts like jewelry, vacations, and even furniture for her apartment. As it turned out, Holly had very, very expensive taste, and she couldn't afford all of the things that she wanted with just the money that she made as an esthetician. So she used escort work to take her finances to a whole other level. Now, of course, as we know, sex work, it can be dangerous, so the police began looking into all of her clients, and they found a couple of potential leads. First of all, when those men knocked on her door and told Holly that they wanted to talk to her, one of them mentioned a specific client by name, and another contact sent her a whole bunch of messages right before her death. He was saved in Holly's phone as Jimmy Green, but it wasn't clear if that was his real name or not. Now, what was interesting, though, was that Jimmy messaged Holly on both of her phones, her personal one and a separate one that she used for her escort work. So it seemed like he knew her well enough to get her personal phone number somewhere along the way. The detectives then looked up the phone number that this Jimmy Green guy was using, and it wasn't real. It was tied to this messaging app called Pinger. Now, that's one of those apps which creates a fake number for you, so you can call or text people without them seeing your real number. The only restriction is you need to be connected to the internet to use it. And it's safe to say that Jimmy was using Pinger so that nobody would be able to connect him to Holly. But he may not have thought that plan through entirely, because the police got a subpoena and they got all of Jimmy's user records from Pinger. Unfortunately, though, that still didn't tell the police who Jimmy Green really was. But they did get his email address. It was jimmygreen34@gmail.com. Now, the good news was Gmail users do have to enter their name when they create an account. The bad news was it doesn't have to be their real name, their legal name, or anything like that. So Jimmy Green put down Agent 47, which was the name of the main character from a video game called Hitman. So to recap, it's a lot, guys. The phone number took the police to a Pinger account. That Pinger account led them to a Gmail address, and that email address belonged to someone who apparently liked video games. But the detectives were not any closer to figuring out who this guy actually was. It seemed like Jimmy Green, or whatever his real name was really good at covering his tracks, especially between all the fake names, the Pinger account, all of these things. It made it hard to pin him down, figure out who he was. But it also helped make him look even more suspicious. I get not wanting anyone to know you're hiring an escort, but his methods of covering his trail were on another level. So at this point, the police decided to try something else. Instead of trying to figure out if Jimmy Green had registered with his real name anywhere on the internet, they did some digging to learn which IP address was associated with his cell phone number. Then they went to some cell phone companies to see if any of them could match the IP address to one of their customers. So basically, instead of looking at what information Jimmy had entered into his online accounts, they were now trying to track down the specific hardware that he was using. And finally, after all of that digging and all of those dead ends, they found the phone that was associated with the IP address. And that phone belonged to a man named Adam Carey. Even better, Adam looked an awful lot like one of those men who had been recorded by Holly's security camera. Specifically, the guy who had part of his face visible. So it was exactly the break in the case that the police needed. Now it was just a matter of figuring out why Adam might have wanted to hurt Holly. Adam had served in the Marines with a special ops team, and after he was discharged, he got a job in private security. But he didn't have a super smooth transition back to civilian life. In 2016, Adam got pulled over because he was impersonating a police officer. The real police searched his car and they found a whole bunch of bombs and other weapons, which to me sounds pretty alarming. I don't know what he was planning to do with all of that, but he only got sentenced to 4 months in prison. And needless to say, Adam sounded like the sort of guy who was more than capable of murdering Bill and Holly. But there was still the question of why. He didn't seem to have any connection to her. He didn't even live in the Nashville area. He was living in North Carolina at the time of the murders. I mean, yes, the police knew that he was texting her on the phone number that she used as an escort, but there was no record that he actually had ever hired her. He also didn't appear on any of her client lists, either his real name or Jimmy Green, and there was nothing that suggested that he might have met her in any other way. So the police then took another look at Adam's Pinger account, the one that he had used so he could text Holly without giving her his real number. And it turned out he had used that account to message somebody else as well. That other person was a guy named Brian Brockway. And apparently he had reached out to Adam because he wanted to hire him for a specific kind of job. It wasn't clear what the gig was, though, at first, but Brian had a lot in common with Adam. See, he was also a Marine who got a job in private security after he was discharged. He worked a lot with high-level government employees, but he was based in Austin, so again, not a Nashville resident and no immediate connection to Holly. After Brian told Adam about this mystery job, Adam sent him a file. It went through on March 9th, 2020, and it was called Tennessee SITREP. Now, it's not super important to the story, but SITREP is a military term short for situational report. Basically, it's just a bunch of information that a military leader might need to know before an operation. In this case, the SITREP was all about Bill and Holly, though, like their schedules, when they usually came, when they went from their house, all sorts of specific details. And Adam also shared the document with one other man named Gilad Peled, who went by Gil for short. Now, just like Adam and Brian, Gil had military experience. He was Israeli and had served with the IDF. According to Gil, he worked in special forces, but that's not quite confirmed. He was also a big guy. I mean, he worked out a lot. So after his discharge, Gil created a private security company in Southern California where he worked for high-profile clients like Charlie Sheen, the actor. Now, I'm not sure why, but he eventually lost that job and moved to Texas afterward. Gil was hoping to start fresh with a brand new security company, which he then called SpearTip. But for whatever reason, he just could not find clients or work the way he had in California. It could be that he wasn't as in demand for private security because he was in Austin and not Hollywood, and Hollywood is the land of celebrities and Austin not so much. But either way, Gil was seriously short on cash and was pretty much ready to accept just about any gig. So because of that, he jumped at an opportunity when a car dealership hired him. It was a place called Charles Maud Toyota, and they had been dealing with trespassing issues. The dealership had been around for decades, so it's no surprise that the founder of Charles Maud Toyota was Charles Maud and his grandson Eric. The two of them owned it. So I know I just ran through a whole bunch of different names, guys, and it can be really tricky to keep track of. So here's the too long didn't read version of all of that. Holly was texting with Adam Carey. Nobody knew how they knew each other. There was no connection between them. But Adam was working with a guy named Brian Brockway, who had hired him for a mystery job. The police didn't know what that job was, but it involved keeping tabs on Holly and Bill. Maybe Brian hired Adam to hurt them, except Brian also didn't have any obvious connections to Holly and Bill. And Brian and Adam were also working with Gil, and Gil worked for Eric Maud, the owner of this dealership. And then finally, after all of this digging, the police were able to connect Gil to Holly. And they were able to do this through Eric. It's a long, long chain of people, but it all did link together. Now, as for how Eric, the car dealer, knew Holly, he had hired her as an escort several times. Like a lot of Holly's clients, he used a fake name, though, and in his case, it was Eric Moore. So about a month before Holly's murder, on February 3rd, 2020, he sent her an email saying that he was going to be in Nashville for a few days coming up. Then, a couple days later, on February 5th, Eric sent Holly a text which read, "Good morning, beautiful. Look forward to today. I'm in Nashville. I'll meet you in the bar like last time. Text me when you arrive." And Eric didn't reach out to Holly again after that. But he did text with Bill, her boyfriend. Now, it's unclear in all of this if Bill was involved in Holly's escort work or what he knew and when. But a month after Eric's trip to Nashville, on March 1st, 2020, Bill hacked into Holly's escort account and found a bunch of information about Holly's clients. And then he sent Eric a bunch of emails basically blackmailing him. See, Eric was married, and he was also super respected in his community, so he had a lot to lose. And Bill could totally trash his reputation if he let everybody know that Eric was seeing an escort. Bill said Eric needed to pay up, or his secret was gonna come out. But rather than pay Bill, Eric reached out to his private security guard, Gil, that very same day. At first, Eric just wanted Gil to figure out who Holly really was, because he knew that her real name couldn't be Layla Love. But apparently, this wasn't Gil's specialty. See, after Eric gave him the orders, Gil reached out to some other people he knew to see if somebody could investigate Layla Love, aka Holly. He wasn't doing it himself. First, Gil asked Brian Brockway for help. Then Brian brought in his brother Chad, who also worked in security. From the sound of it, Chad had no idea what was going on, though. Gil made up a sob story about how a girl had gone missing and was now working as an escort, so Chad thought that maybe he was helping some poor girl reunite with her worried family, and he ended up digging up all of her information, and then he sent it to Brian. Once Brian had all of Chad's findings, he brought in Adam Carey, who then texted Holly from that pinger app. And he didn't just text her. After he joined the job, Adam decided to go straight to the source and confront Holly directly. And he brought some of his friends with him for that. Those two other guys who showed up on that security camera footage. So eventually, Adam realized that Holly wasn't extorting money from Eric, but her boyfriend Bill, he was. It's not clear to me how he figured it out, but basically Adam untangled the whole complicated web. So the next step for Adam was to do something about it. And this meant sending both Bill and Holly messages on the pinger app. And then he followed Bill to the grocery store. I'm not sure Bill knew that he was being followed, though. I do know that on March 11th, Bill called Eric, that car dealer, at home, presumably to keep pressuring him for that payoff. Then, after that phone call, Eric realized, I've had enough. And not long after that, Brian told Gil that he and Adam were authorized to kill both Bill and Holly if it came down to it. Right afterward, Adam sent his two companions home, presumably so there would be as few witnesses as possible, and then the very next day, Brian flew out to Nashville. So the day after that, which was now March 12th, Holly and Bill were killed. It's still unclear exactly how and where everything went down, though, but thanks to those security cameras at Holly's apartment, we know that she and Bill left her place at around 11:40 p.m. Apparently, even with the restraining order and all of their recent fights, he was still with her that night. So they walked out the door, headed toward the parking garage. Then, a second or two later, Bill went back like he had forgotten something inside. He grabbed whatever it was, and then he and Holly left again for real. They walked off, and because of how the cameras were pointed, we don't know where they went. But they were still headed toward the parking area. Then, after they left the frame, the cameras recorded the sound of a car starting. Then, multiple gunshots, and a man and a woman yelling. After that, the sound faded to silence. Now, nobody in the apartment complex heard any of this. It was just from the security camera. But still, the footage was enough for the police to come up with a theory. A new theory. Adam and Brian attacked the couple right after they left the apartment. Right there in the parking lot. They shot Bill on purpose because he was the one behind all of the blackmailing, and then they accidentally hit Holly in the chest. Once they realized that they had two bodies to take care of, they drove Holly's car to the dump site. When they got there, they realized that Holly wasn't dead, so they shot her again in the head this time. Then Adam and Brian got out of the car but left it in drive so that it could roll into the woods. Based on some separate gas station security camera footage, we know that after the murders, Adam and Brian drove to Memphis, Tennessee. Adam dropped Brian off at the Memphis airport, and then from there he flew home to Austin, and Adam drove back to North Carolina. Now, weirdly, after all of this went down, Eric left an online review for Gil's company, Spear Tip. It was like having somebody murdered was right up there with getting, I don't know, a new pair of socks on Amazon or something, and that you want to leave a 5-star review. Now, obviously, the review, it didn't say exactly what Gil did, but it did say, Spear Tip is very professional and on top of it. They got the job done in an expedited time. Couldn't imagine using anyone else. Now again, I kind of just can't get past this online review, guys. I guess if anybody asked, Eric could have said that Gil had handled the trespassing issue at his car dealership, but it's absurd to me that Adam and the others went to such extreme lengths to cover their tracks just for Eric to basically broadcast to all of the world that he had hired them. And he had hired them for a hit. Some criminals are just dumb, dumb, dumb. Now, because it was pretty easy for the FBI to pull all of Eric's financial records, they were able to see that he had paid all three killers almost $1 million combined. Now, I'm sure if you can tell from everything I've covered already, this was an extremely complex investigation. There were a ton of dead ends and false starts, and what the detectives did eventually find was incredibly complicated. That might be why it took the police 2 whole years to slowly piece everything together. But they were still missing one thing. Proof that Eric ordered the hit. Because otherwise it would have been easy for him to just say he hired Gil and the others to, learn Holly and Bill's identity, something like that. Then he could claim that the killers went rogue and he had nothing to do with the murders, right? In fact, some of their text messages did make it sound like the plan was just to kidnap Bill and Holly, just to scare them. So if the detectives wanted to nail everyone, including Eric, they needed somebody to confess that the murder was premeditated and that it was authorized by him. Now, the police didn't want to tip anybody off that they were a suspect, and especially given that so many of these guys had military backgrounds, it would have been super easy for one or more of them to flee the country and escape justice altogether. This meant that the detectives weren't super eager to pull anybody in for an interrogation. They needed to find a way to get the information without actually questioning Adam, Brian, Gil, or Eric. So they decided to contact Brian's brother, Chad Brockway. Now remember, back when Chad got involved in this scheme, he thought that Holly was a missing woman and that he was helping in all of this. He had no idea that anybody planned to hurt or kill her. So when the police approached him and he learned the truth about everything that went down, he agreed. He said he would cooperate with the investigation and even that he would go undercover to get more information. The idea was that Chad was going to call Adam and ask him to commit another murder for hire. When he reached out, Adam was surprisingly chill about the whole conversation too. He talked to Chad all through the process, going into detail about what kind of tools he would need, and then he told Chad his rate. It was going to be $60,000. For a cool $60,000, he will commit murder. All of which confirmed for the police that Adam was not only willing to kill people for money, but he was also very, very familiar with the process. So then Chad asked his brother Brian to meet him at a restaurant in downtown Austin. And there he wore a wire. but Brian wasn't very talkative. I mean, at least not at first. After they were done eating, Chad and Brian walked out to the parking lot together, and then finally, Brian started to open up right before they got into the car. So Chad knew that this was his opportunity. So he asked him all about Eric, Holly, and Bill, and Brian went into detail. Among other things, he said that when he killed them, Bill tried to fight back. It actually sounded a lot like Brian was bragging, like he was proud of himself that he overpowered and murdered another guy. He also said that Adam was the one who killed Holly, and that he thought that it was kind of impressive in a way, because according to Brian, most men don't have the courage to shoot a woman. Which I just have to say, how absolutely vile is that? To act like killing an innocent person who never did anything to you is some sort of, badge of honor? What a garbage fire of a human being to say these things. I mean, causing harm to another person does not take courage, and it definitely doesn't make you more of a man. So luckily, Brian, Adam, and Gil were all arrested on December 10th, 2021. The police did their best to coordinate the arrests so that they all happened simultaneously, more or less, for the same reason that they hadn't done any of those interrogations beforehand. They were worried that if any of these men learned that they were wanted or they were about to be arrested or tipped off, that they would skip town. But they still waited to go after Eric. From the sound of it, they still couldn't prove that Eric actually hired anybody to kill Bill and Holly, as opposed to, Adam, Brian, and Gil making the call to escalate to murder on their own. That said, the investigators were also pretty sure that none of the killers for hire were willing to take the fall for Eric either. So now, with all three of them in custody, they sat down with Gil, and they said that he could help himself if he helped them. They told him to call Eric and say that Adam wanted more money, that for $25,000 more, they would keep quiet about the hit. And Gil went along with the plan. He called Eric and he told him that they needed more cash. And Eric said, quote, "I'll pay the guy $25,000, but I think he needs to go away after that. He did a solid for me, and I appreciate him for that, but I just want to make sure it's, that in 6 months down the road, he isn't going to pop back up. Honestly, I'd rather just take care of him permanently, and then I'll just run $150,000 through Spear Tip like last time." So this was exactly what the police needed. They immediately sent officers to arrest Eric, who was on the road after a hunting trip at the time. The police pulled him over during the drive back, and with that, they had their last killer in custody. In December of 2022, Gil pled guilty to murder for hire resulting in a death, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and kidnapping resulting in a death. As of this recording, he still hasn't been sentenced, though, and in part because his deal required him to testify against the other three. The prosecutors wanted to make sure that he held up his side of the bargain before they decided what his punishment would be. It took almost another whole year before Eric, Adam, and Brian faced the jury in November of 2023. They were all tried together, but they each had their own lawyer, so the courtroom, it was actually pretty chaotic. Their defense teams tried to argue that Gil had actually tricked Eric into hiring the other two. And then, to hear them tell it, Bill killed himself and Holly, just like the police originally suspected. So basically, the argument was that Gil, Adam, and Brian just had the terrible luck to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a complete coincidence that Holly and Bill died right when these paid private security contractors were tailing them. Okay, right. Now, obviously, that didn't sound likely at all. Plus, Gil didn't go along with their cover story. He was very detailed during his testimony, saying that at first, the plan was just to kidnap Bill and Holly, try to scare them. But when Brian came up with the idea to kill the couple and made the offer to Eric, Eric agreed right away. So after about 2 weeks and 7 hours of deliberation, the jury decided they agreed with Gil's version of events. They found Adam and Brian guilty of conspiracy to commit murder for hire, guilty of kidnapping resulting in death, and guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Eric was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder for hire and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. All of them, including Gil, could be sentenced to life in prison, and we'll find out more when they have their hearings later in sometime 2024. But for now, Holly and Bill have to wait for justice. So do their friends and family members. And I have to say, they must be enraged that Bill and Holly died for such a stupid reason. Eric cheated on his wife, then panicked when he thought that he would get caught. It's all just such a pointless reason to take somebody's life, and it really speaks to how self-absorbed this guy was. He thought that his reputation was worth more than Holly's life, even after it turned out that she had nothing to do with the blackmailing. I also feel especially bad for Holly in all of this, who I have to imagine never had any idea that Bill had hacked into her account to blackmail her clients. From her perspective, it was like these scary men just started showing up at her door one day and out of nowhere. She was terrified of them, and she was also terrified of her on and off again boyfriend, but she never knew why all of these people wanted to hurt her. Of everybody in this story, Holly was the most innocent, and that wasn't enough to save her life. It's honestly just so gut-wrenching when you think of it, to think that somebody could be plotting to kill you over something that you didn't even do. It's really sad and it's really tragic, and who knows what her life could have gone on to be and who she could have met if she got away from Bill, and really what her life could have become. It's a very tragic case, but I appreciate you hearing her story so that her voice continues on, and so that all of these men, even though Bill is technically a victim, yes, he also did some really bad stuff to her. So like all of these men can be called out for who they are and what they did, right? I feel like that's so important. I told you guys it was a roller coaster of a case, so let me know what you think about it in the comments. Do you think that Bill was maybe managing Holly's finances and that's why he went to blackmail them? Do you think he just hacked into her phone and she didn't know that he even knew about it? Like, what do you think the truth really is here? In any event, it's just a horrific tragedy that never had to happen. It's like, I always say, don't murder people, just get a divorce or just stack up to your shit. Like, Eric, you were cheating, own up to it. Who cares? Your reputation's going to be tarnished from a car dealership. Like, give me a break. Instead, you're going to hire for a double murder? Make it make sense, right? So let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments. And other than that, I'm going to go ice my jaw. Thank you so much for tuning in with me today. And until the next one, stay safe. Bye.